The morning Grace Morgan walked into the Hayes City Land Office. She carried nothing but a folded deed, a dead husband's name, and a courage so quiet it could have been mistaken for stubbornness. And by the time she left, every man in that room would understand the difference. It was the spring of 1873, and the Kansas plains were still raw and open, the kind of land that swallowed whole families whole and asked no apology for it. The grasslands rolled west of Hayes City like a green and amber sea, broken only by limestone outcroppings, and the occasional cottonwood standing lonely as a forgotten promise. The town itself had grown up fast and rough around the railroad, the way most Kansas towns did in those years, and it wore its youth plainly unpainted storefronts, mud streets after any rain, and a courthouse that leaned slightly to the left as though it were perpetually uncertain of itself. Grace had arrived in Hayes City 7 months prior, in the autumn of 1872, riding in the back of a freight wagon with her 6-year-old daughter, Clara, pressed against her side, and everything she owned packed into 2 trunks that had once belonged to her mother. She had come from Missouri, from a farm outside of Independence where she and her husband Thomas had built something small but real. Thomas Morgan had been a good man, earnest and patient, the kind of man who fixed fence posts on Sunday mornings because he loved the land more than he loved rest. A fever had taken him in August, swift and merciless, and left Grace with a daughter, a debt she had not known existed, and a life that needed to be dismantled at 31 years old. She had heard of the Homestead Act. She had read about it, in fact, in a newspaper that a neighbor woman had brought over during the long weeks of Thomas's illness, thinking the news might distract her. The act had been law since 1862, and it promised 160 acres of public land to any citizen who could prove up on it, live there, improve it, farm it for 5 years. Women could file. That was the part that had stayed with her, a small bright sentence tucked inside a column of dense print. Women who were heads of household could file. Grace had folded that newspaper carefully and kept it. By the time she reached Hayes City, she had already decided. She found work at the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, a sturdy and practical widow herself, who recognized in Grace something she admired and did not ask too many questions. Grace washed linens and helped with meals and saved every cent she did not need for herself and Clara. She walked out onto the prairie on her days off and studied the land the way other women studied patterns for dresses. She asked questions of the old sodbusters who came into town for supplies, about water and soil, and which way the wind came hardest in winter. By April of 1873, she was ready. The land office in Hayes City occupied a narrow building between a hardware store and a saloon, which Grace had always thought said something important about the nature of the frontier. The office was presided over by a man named Clement Briggs, who had the pink, self-satisfied look of someone who had never done a day's physical labor, and deeply resented anyone who implied that he should. Briggs was 43, soft-jowled, and had developed over his years as land agent a particular method of making legal processes seem far more complicated and uncertain than they actually were, especially when the person on the other side of his desk was someone he did not expect to succeed. The room was busier than Grace had anticipated. It was a Thursday morning and half a dozen men were already inside, some waiting to file, some disputing boundaries, one man sleeping in the corner under his hat. They stood or sat in rough wooden chairs along the wall, and they all looked up when Grace came through the door with Clara holding her hand. Grace wore her good dress, the dark blue wool one that she had pressed carefully the night before. Her brown hair was pinned back neatly. She was not a woman who had ever been described as beautiful in the conventional sense. Her face was too strong for that, her jaw too set, her eyes too direct, but she had the kind of presence that a room felt. Clara, in her small cotton dress with the white collar, looked up at the men with the frank and fearless curiosity of a child who had already been through enough to know that most things were survivable. Grace walked to the counter and set down her folded papers. Clement Briggs looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man whose morning had just become inconvenient. "I am here to file a homestead claim," Grace said, and her voice was steady as the horizon outside. Briggs looked at the papers, then at her, then at Clara, and let the silence stretch out in the way that men in positions of small authority sometimes do, to remind you that they hold the power and you must wait on their pleasure. "Mrs. he began. "Morgan," she said. "Grace Morgan, widow of Thomas Morgan, formerly of Jackson County, Missouri. I am filing as head of household under the Homestead Act of 1862. One of the men along the wall shifted in his chair. Another cleared his throat. Briggs picked up the papers with 2 fingers as though they might be damp, and made a show of reading them, though Grace was quite certain he had identified every piece in about 4 seconds. He set them down. "You understand," he said slowly, "that proving up on 160 acres is not a simple matter. It requires you to reside on the claim, build a structure, break a portion of the ground for cultivation." "I know what it requires," Grace said. "I have read the act in full." There was a very slight stir in the room behind her. Briggs shifted his weight. "There is also the matter of the particular parcel you have indicated here." He tapped her papers with 1 finger. "That ground is not exactly settled country. There are other parties who have expressed interest. Has anyone filed on it?" "Not formally, no, but—" "Then it is open public land," Grace said, "and I am filing on it today." The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the dull silence of waiting men. It had texture now, something watchful and alive. Grace did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Clement Briggs, and she waited. From the back of the room, where the man had been sitting quietly with his hat resting on his knee, came a sound. Not a word exactly. More of a slow exhale. The sound a man makes when he has witnessed something that reorganizes his understanding of the world slightly. Elijah Haskins had come into the land office that morning on purely routine business. A boundary clarification on the grazing lease he held southeast of town. Nothing dramatic. He was 28 years old, tall and weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their waking hours outdoors, with dark eyes that were patient and watchful, and a jaw covered in several days of dark stubble. He had ridden for the Prescott Ranch for 4 years. Done his job honestly, spent his evenings reading when he could get hold of books, and kept mostly to himself because he had found that was usually the cleanest way to live. He was not a man who was easily moved. He had seen a fair portion of hard country, and he had learned early that the prairie tended to humble a person's enthusiasm. But he had never seen anything quite like Grace Morgan standing at that counter. It was not about the dress or the way she had pinned her hair. It was something structural, something in the architecture of the moment. A woman who had lost everything a person could reasonably lose, standing in front of a bureaucrat who wanted to turn her back, and she was not flinching. Not even slightly. She was standing the way the limestone outcropping stood on the prairie, as if weather were simply something that happened around them. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. Briggs was speaking again, pushing back now with the particular cowardice of men who cannot say no directly, but who can create enough friction that people give up on their own. "Mrs. Morgan, the filing fee is $14, and you would need 2 witnesses who can attest." "I have the $14, Grace said, and she opened the small leather purse she carried and set the coins on the counter one by one, each one making a clean, precise sound against the wood. "And as for witnesses," she turned for the first time and looked at the room full of men, "I require 2 men willing to witness my signature." The room went quiet in a different way now. There was a moment Grace felt it, the held breath of it, where the men along the wall looked at their boots or their hands or the middle distance, the way men sometimes do when a thing is being asked of them that carries a social cost. And then Elijah Haskins stood up. He stood slowly, the way tall men do in low-ceilinged rooms, unfolding himself from the chair with a deliberateness that was not dramatic but was completely certain. He settled his hat under his arm and walked forward through the small crowd. "I will witness," he said simply. His voice was quiet and even, but it carried. Every man in that room heard it. An older farmer named Walt Gruber, who had been sitting 3 chairs down from where Elijah had been, cleared his throat once and then stood up as well, looking slightly embarrassed by his own hesitation. "I will witness too," he said gruffly. Clement Briggs had no more room to maneuver. His face had gone through several interesting colors, and he settled finally on a kind of resigned pink. He pulled out the correct form, dipped his pen, and began filling in the particulars with the mechanical efficiency of a man who knows when he has lost. Grace signed her name in clear, firm letters. Elijah signed beneath hers and Walt Gruber signed beneath his, and the whole thing was done in less than 3 minutes. When Grace turned around with her receipt and her copy of the filed claim, she found Elijah Haskins standing a few feet away, his hat now in both hands. Up close he was, she noticed this against her will, the way you notice the temperature of a room changing, quite markedly present. There was something in his eyes that was not pity, which was the thing she had braced herself against. It was something simpler and more direct than pity. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every careful word. "It was the bravest thing I have ever seen," he said, quietly enough that it was just for her, and the honesty of it, not the prettiness but the plainness of it, hit her somewhere she had not expected. She looked at him for a moment and she could feel Clara's small hand tightening around her fingers. "My name is Elijah Haskins," he said. "I ride for the Prescott spread." "Grace Morgan," she said. "I am about to become a farmer." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. "Good luck to you, Mrs. Morgan," he said. She walked out into the spring sunlight with Clara and her land claim receipt, and the echo of a stranger's voice saying it was the bravest thing he had ever seen, and she thought about it for exactly 1 block before she told herself firmly to think about water tables and seed prices instead. She did not entirely succeed. The parcel Grace had filed on was 12 miles southwest of Hays City, a piece of open grassland with a creek running along the eastern edge and good southern exposure. She had chosen it after 3 separate scouting trips on horseback, borrowing Mrs. Aldridge's old mare and riding out in the early mornings. The creek was the most important thing. Thomas had taught her that water first, then everything else. The creek was fed by a spring uphill and ran reliably. She had been told by a Cheyenne man named Running Fox who had camped in the area the previous winter and who she had spoken with one afternoon while she was scouting. He had confirmed the spring and warned her about the western drainage in heavy rains. She had thanked him and listened carefully. She began building in May. Mrs. Aldridge allowed Grace and Clara to remain at the boarding house for 2 more months on reduced board, in exchange for continued work, which gave Grace time to work on the claim during the days. She hired 2 men from town, a Swedish immigrant named Anders Lindqvist and his teenage son, to help her cut and stack the sod blocks for a soddy. The 3 of them worked in the early mornings before the heat came, and Grace learned fast and was not delicate about it. Her hands blistered and then hardened. Her arms grew strong. Anders Lindqvist was a decent man who treated her with a straightforward respect that she appreciated enormously. He had built 3 soddies himself, and he taught her without condescension, showing her how to stack the bricks in alternating layers for strength, how to angle the roof grass side down, how to leave the right gap for a window frame. By late June, the soddy was standing. It was small, 1 main room with a sleeping alcove, but it was solid and the roof held and the single window faced east for the morning light. Grace stood outside it on the evening it was finished and watched the sun go down over her land and felt something she had not felt since Thomas died, something that was not exactly happiness but was the necessary precursor to it. She moved herself and Clara out to the claim in early July. The first weeks were consuming in the way that genuine work always is. She broke ground for a kitchen garden. The larger field would have to wait until she could afford a proper plow team, and planted late-season vegetables. She learned the rhythms of the creek and the patterns of the wind. Clara, who was a child of extraordinary adaptability, took to prairie life with a seriousness that sometimes made Grace laugh helplessly. The little girl had appointed herself the official keeper of what she called the good rocks she found along the creek bank, and she organized them with a thoroughness that suggested she might have a future as a surveyor. It was on a Saturday in July, 3 weeks after Grace had moved onto the claim, that Elijah Haskins came riding down the creek track. She was in the garden when she heard the hoofbeats, and she straightened up and shaded her eyes. He was riding a big bay horse, and he had something tied across the saddle behind him. He pulled up at a respectful distance from the garden and took off his hat. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, "I hope I am not intruding." She looked at him steadily. "You rode 12 miles to ask that." The corner of his mouth moved. "I was in the area," he said, which was probably not entirely true given that the Prescott Ranch lay in the other direction. "I heard you had moved onto your claim. I thought I brought lumber." He indicated the boards tied to the saddle. "For a door frame. The Prescott foreman was replacing some outbuildings and there was extra. He said I could have it." Grace looked at the lumber, then at him. She had been propping the door opening with a piece of canvas stretched over a wooden frame. A proper door would be a significant improvement. "That is generous," she said carefully. "It is just lumber," he said. She almost smiled. "Do you know how to hang a door?" "I do," he said. "Then climb down, Mr. Haskins." Clara had appeared from around the corner of the soddy and was looking at the bay horse with the focused intensity she brought to all things that interested her. Elijah swung down and crouched to the child's level in a way that was natural and unself-conscious. "That is a fine horse," Clara informed him gravely. "His name is Copper," Elijah said, equally grave. "He thinks very highly of himself." Clara considered this. "Does he like apples?" "More than almost anything." "We have an apple," Clara said, and looked at her mother with eyes that were already calculating. Grace put her hands on her hips and looked at her daughter. "One apple," she said. The afternoon that followed was one Grace would think about for a long time afterward, in the way that certain hours leave a mark, not because of anything dramatic that occurs, but because of their particular quality of being. Elijah worked on the door frame steadily, measuring and fitting with the careful attention of a man who had built things before, and Grace worked nearby on the garden and occasionally passed him a tool when he needed one. Clara fed Copper his apple in tiny ceremonial pieces and then settled in the shade of the soddy wall with her good rocks and her own inner world. The creek made its small sounds. The afternoon light moved across the grass. They did not talk much, but when they did, the conversation had an ease that surprised her. He asked about Missouri, and she told him honestly, including about Thomas, not wrapping it in the soft language that people sometimes expected from widows. Thomas had been good, and she had loved him, and he was gone, and she had found a way to keep moving, and she told it plainly. Elijah listened without filling the pauses with sympathy noises, which she appreciated. She asked about him. He was from Tennessee originally, he said, the third son of a farming family who had not had enough land to divide 3 ways, so he had gone west at 19, drifted through Texas and New Mexico, ended up in Kansas because someone had offered him honest work and he had taken it. He had been riding for Prescott 4 years, and it was steady, but it was not his own. "You want your own," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "Most people do," he said. "Most people do not always admit it," she said. He went quiet for a moment, fitting a board. Then, "I filed a homestead claim last fall," he said. "Parcel about 8 miles east of here. I have been proving up on it on my days off, building slow." She was surprised and showed it. "You are homesteading while working for Prescott." "Prescott knows. He is a fair man." Elijah drove a nail cleanly. "It is slow going alone." "Yes," Grace said, looking at her garden. "It is." When he was done with the door frame, he had produced from his saddlebag a pair of proper hinges that he had clearly brought deliberately. He did not make a ceremony of it, just fitted them in place and hung the door. A solid plank door that she had built from salvaged boards, and it swung true and latched cleanly, and Grace opened and closed it twice to feel the satisfying solidness of it. "Thank you," she said, standing in her own doorway. He was already gathering his tools. "Thank you for the company," he said simply. He called to Clara, who came running to pat Copper's nose one more time, and then he mounted up. "You are welcome back, Mr. Haskins," Grace said, and surprised herself with how much she meant it. He nodded once, put his hat on, and rode back up the creek track. Grace watched him go and then looked down at Clara, who was watching the horse disappear with an expression of solemn appreciation. "He is nice," Clara said. "He hung us a good door," Grace agreed, and went inside. He came back the following Saturday and the one after that. There was no pretense about it after the third visit. He came because he wanted to, and she let him because she wanted him to, and they both understood this without stating it directly. The way adults on the frontier sometimes communicate the important things sidelong, through behavior rather than declaration, because the country was too demanding and life too uncertain for elaborate performance. He brought things when he came, not gifts exactly, because that would have been presumptuous and they both knew it, but useful things. A coil of rope, a second-hand axe head that he had rehandled himself. Information about the land, about what the other homesteaders southeast of him were planting, about where the best timber for future construction could be hauled from. In return, Grace fed him. She was a good cook, practical and capable, the kind of cooking that was actually nourishing and did not waste anything. The first time she set a plate in front of him, he looked at it with an expression she could not fully read, and then ate with a quiet thoroughness that told her everything about how long it had been since someone had cooked for him with actual care. "You do not have to bring things every time," she told him one afternoon in August when she had found a box of candles tied to Copper's saddle. "The nights are getting longer," he said. "Elijah," she said, and the use of his first name surprised them both slightly, though she had been thinking of him that way for several weeks already. She saw him go still for just a moment. "I am not a charity case." He turned and looked at her directly, the way he sometimes did when something mattered. "I know that better than almost anyone in this county," he said. "I watched you file that claim." She held his gaze for a moment. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Not harshly, she was genuinely asking. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be honest. "I want to come back next Saturday," he said finally. She looked at him. "Then come back," she said. He came back. The summer deepened and the days grew longer and the prairie bloomed golden, and something was happening between Grace Morgan and Elijah Haskins that neither of them was in a hurry to name. It was not a young person's love, the kind that ignites fast and burns at a visible temperature. Grace was 31 and had been married and widowed, and had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and she had no capacity left for anything that was not real. Elijah was 28 and had spent enough years alone to know the difference between comfort and connection, and he was not interested in the former. What was happening between them was something that grew the way prairie grass grows, slowly, with deep roots, resilient. By September, he was helping her break the larger field. She had managed to borrow a plow team from Walt Gruber, the older farmer who had been her second witness at the land office, and who had turned out to be a surprisingly generous neighbor. And Elijah spent 3 consecutive Saturdays helping her turn the earth. They worked alongside each other in the long slants of September light, and the field opened up behind them in dark furrows, and Clara ran along the broken edges, catching the earthworms that the plow disturbed with a collection bucket, and a focus that would have honored a scientist. It was during the second of those Saturdays that the trouble came. A man named Franklin Cade rode up to the claim in the early afternoon with 2 other men behind him. Cade was a land speculator who operated out of Hays City, and who had, in the months since Grace filed her claim, made it his particular project to discourage her. He had sent a letter through Clement Briggs, suggesting that her filing might be challenged on some procedural ground. He had told people in town that a woman alone could not prove up on 160 acres. He had not done anything that rose to the level of the illegal, but he had done everything just short of it. Grace had ignored all of it, which had apparently made him bold enough to come in person. Elijah saw them coming before Grace did. He set down the plow handles and stood, and his stillness was a different kind of stillness than his usual one. Cade pulled up at the edge of the field. He was a florid man in an expensive coat, which looked absurd on the prairie, and he had the particular smile of a man who is about to say something unpleasant in a pleasant voice. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, "how industrious you look." Grace straightened from the plow and looked at him. "Mr. Cade, I have heard from a party in the county seat who has raised some questions about the specific acreage you filed on," Cade said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "It seems there may be a prior survey conflict. You may need to relinquish the eastern portion, the part with your water source, for resolution." Elijah had moved without appearing to move, the way experienced men sometimes do. He was simply standing now at Grace's right side, a position that was unmistakably deliberate. "That is a false document, Mr. Cade," Grace said, and her voice was steady. "I have the county survey on file. The eastern boundary is clear." "Well, now, these things can be complicated," Cade said, his smile remaining. He looked at Elijah. "Haskins, you are a long way from the Prescott spread." "I am exactly where I mean to be," Elijah said. The two men behind Cade shifted slightly in their saddles. Cade looked from Elijah to Grace and back, performing a calculation. "Mrs. Morgan, I am trying to make this easy for you," Cade said, the pleasantness in his voice now carrying an edge. "A woman alone, she is not alone," Elijah said. The words were quiet and simply stated, and they landed in the air between them like a stone into still water. Cade held the moment for another few seconds, then folded his document back into his coat. "I will be in touch through proper channels," he said. "You are welcome to try," Grace said. They rode away. Grace watched them go, and she did not let out her breath until they were dots on the horizon. Then she turned and looked at Elijah, who was still standing at her right side, and she felt something move in her chest that was more complicated than gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "I did not do anything," he said. "You stood there," she said. "That was something." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought he might say something else, but he just picked up the plow handles again and got back to work. She stood there a moment longer, watching the set of his shoulders before she did the same. That evening, after the work was done and Clara had fallen asleep in the sleeping alcove with two of her best rocks for company, Grace and Elijah sat outside the soddy in the cooling air, the kind of September evening where the sky goes through every shade of gold and rose before it settles into dark. They had coffee from the pot she kept on the stove, and the creek murmured somewhere below the bank, and the first stars came out one by one. "What Cade said," Grace began. "He will try something legal next," Elijah said. "He is the kind of man who uses the law the way other men use fists." "I know." Grace wrapped her hands around her tin cup. "I have been preparing for it. I wrote to the land office in Topeka last month, requesting confirmation of my survey boundaries." He looked at her sideways. "You already did that. Before he showed up today, yes." She allowed herself a small smile. "I told you, I have read the act in full." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him looking at her with that particular attention of his, the kind that was neither intrusive nor distant but fully present. It made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in a long time. "Grace," he said. Her name in his mouth was a different thing from Mrs. Morgan. She had known that since the first time he used it, a few weeks ago. It was a different thing, and she let it be. "I want to say something," he said carefully. "Then say it," she said. He turned to face her more fully in the darkening evening. "What I am building east of here," he said. "I want it to be something real, not just a shack on a piece of land, something worth living in." He paused. "I have been thinking for a while now about what that means. What makes a thing worth living in?" She looked at the stars appearing above the grass line. "And what did you decide?" "People," he said simply. "The right people." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds something important without spilling it. "You are not a man who speaks indirectly," Grace said finally. "Not usually," he agreed. She turned to look at him then, and in the low light his face was serious and open, the mask of reserve that he wore in public entirely gone. She thought about the land office in April, about the way he had stood up when no one else did. She thought about the door frame and the candles and the plowing and the way he had moved to stand beside her when Cade came. She thought about Clara asking him every week whether Copper had enjoyed the journey. She thought about how alone she had been, and how the loneliness had become such a familiar weight that she had almost stopped noticing it, and how in the last 3 months it had quietly, without announcement, lifted. "I am not ready," she said honestly. "I am not. There are things I need to still do on my own, for me, for Clara. I need to prove this claim with my own 2 hands, not because someone helped me do it." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you to stop." "I know," she said. "I know you are not." "I am just asking," he said slowly, "if there is a place for me in what you are building." She looked at him for a long moment, and the stars spread out above them in their old, indifferent beauty, and the creek ran on, and somewhere in the sleeping alcove Clara turned over on her small cot with a small sigh. "Come back next Saturday," Grace said. He held her gaze and then nodded once, and there was something in that nod that was not frustration or impatience. It was patience of a real and unhurried kind, the patience of a man who understood that good things were built slowly and that the building itself had a value. "I will," he said. He rode home in the dark, and she stood outside the soddy for a while after Copper's hoofbeats faded, looking at the sky. October arrived with its first hard edges of cold, and Grace drove herself the way she always had, harder than most people thought was wise. She finished breaking the field with one final borrowed plow session, managing most of it herself by now. She winterized the soddy banking earth against the walls for insulation, stuffing the window gaps with cloth and grease-soaked wool, cutting and stacking the largest pile of fuel she could manage. She put up the last of the garden vegetables in crocks and dried strips of beef that Walt Gruber had given her in exchange for help mending his barn. And she fought Franklin Cade on paper, which turned out to be the real battle. The legal challenge he had threatened materialized in mid-October. A formal complaint filed with the county land commissioner claiming that Grace's filing contained an error in the legal description of her eastern boundary. It was thin, and she knew it was thin, but it was enough to require a response and a potential hearing, and Clement Briggs, predictably, was handling it with maximum inconvenience. Grace spent 3 evenings writing responses by candlelight, referencing the Homestead Act by section number, attaching her Topeka correspondence, building her case with the same care she had built her soddy walls. Clara sat across from her at the small table on those evenings, asleep or pretending to be asleep over her own slate where she was learning her letters, and Grace wrote and revised and organized until her eyes ached. Elijah read her draft response on one of his Saturdays and said carefully that it was well argued, but she prompted. "There is a lawyer in Hays City," he said, "name of Aldous Freeman. He is a fair man and he does not charge more than he has to. He took a homesteader's case against a railroad claim agent 2 years ago and won it." Grace looked at her carefully written pages. "I cannot afford, let me pay the consultation," he said. She opened her mouth. "Not a gift," he said before she could speak. "A loan at whatever terms you want to set." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in accepting help that still pulled against her, the pride of a woman who had built her survival on her own strength. She felt it, recognized it, and thought carefully about whether it was wisdom or stubbornness. $1, she said finally. "I will repay you $1 per month." "That is more than fair," he said. Aldous Freeman was, as promised, a genuinely useful man. He was a thin, precise man of 50 who wore wire-rimmed spectacles, and who, when Grace laid out her case and her documents, went through them with a thoroughness that both impressed and slightly intimidated her. He found 2 additional supporting statutes she had not cited, pointed out a procedural error in Cade's filing that could be used against him, and agreed to represent her at the county hearing for $15 total, which Grace bit her lip and agreed to. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of November, before the county commissioner in Hays City. In the weeks between, Grace worked and worried in equal measure, though she showed the worrying to almost no one. Elijah knew, because Elijah was perceptive in the way of people who spend a lot of time paying attention, but he did not press her about it. He helped where she let him help, and he was steady, and that steadiness had become something she relied on in a way she was only now fully acknowledging to herself. One evening in late October, when the temperatures had dropped hard and the first frost had silvered the grass, and the light inside the soddy was warm and enclosed in a way that made the outside world seem distant, she told him about Thomas. Not the bare facts she had given him before, but the real version, the year of the bad drought, the debt they had taken on that she had not fully known about until after Thomas died, the way the farm had to be sold, and how she had stood in the yard on the last morning and not cried because she needed to not cry in front of Clara, and how she had cried for the whole first day of the freight wagon ride west, quietly, with her face turned toward the canvas so her daughter would not see. Elijah listened to all of it without filling it up with words. When she was done, he said, "He would be glad of what you are doing." She considered that. "I think he would," she said. Thomas was not, he would not have seen this as something strange, a woman doing this. He would have seen it as practical. She paused. He was a practical man. "So are you," Elijah said. "I am," she agreed, "though I have been told it is not a feminine quality." "Then the people who told you that did not know much," he said, and there was enough quiet heat in that simple statement that Grace looked away from him after a moment because something in her chest was doing something that she had not felt in a very long time. She missed Thomas. She would always miss Thomas, but grief was not a house you lived in forever. It was a country you passed through, and you carried what you could, and eventually you came out the other side into a landscape that was different from what you had expected but real, and you stood in it and breathed and learned its particular beauty. She thought, sitting across from Elijah Haskins in the warm lamplight of her small soddy, that she was standing in that landscape now. The county hearing in November was held in the courthouse, which had not visibly improved its leftward lean since the spring. The commissioner was a man named Judge Orville Webb, white-haired and meticulous, who was known for his intense personal hatred of procedural errors and his equally intense suspicion of land speculators, having been on the frontier long enough to have watched several families lose land to them. The hearing room was small, but it was full. Word had gotten around Hays City, the way word always gets around in small frontier towns, and there were a dozen people in attendance, including Walt Gruber, Mrs. Aldridge, Anders Lindqvist, and several other small farmers and homesteaders who had a natural interest in the outcome. Clement Briggs sat to the side with an expression of practiced neutrality. Franklin Cade sat across from Grace with a lawyer of his own, a man from the county seat who had expensive boots and the manner of someone accustomed to being the most educated person in the room. Aldous Freeman, Grace's lawyer, sat beside her in his spectacles and his deliberate calm, with their documents arranged in a stack between them. Elijah sat in the back of the room, hat in his lap. The hearing proceeded with the measured formality of legal procedure, which Grace had learned to move through as though it were a physical landscape. You had to know where the solid ground was and stay on it. Freeman presented her case first, methodically and without drama, citing the survey, the filing, the Topeka correspondence, and the procedural error in Cade's complaint. Cade's lawyer then argued his client's position, which was clever in a circuitous way and would have been more convincing if the underlying facts had been stronger. Judge Webb interrupted him twice to ask specific questions about the survey and received answers that were not quite as confident as they should have been. Then Grace spoke, because Judge Webb invited her to, which Cade's lawyer had clearly not expected. She stood and she spoke clearly and without embellishment about the land she had filed on, why she had chosen it, what she had done to improve it, what it represented for herself and her daughter. She cited the Homestead Act by section and statute. She cited the county survey. She stated plainly that Cade's interest in the eastern boundary was coincident with the location of her water source and that this was not accidental. When she was done, the room was very quiet. Judge Webb looked at Cade's lawyer over his spectacles for a moment that was quite long. "Mr. Harrington," he said, "your client's filing contains an error in its legal description of the contested boundary, as referenced in Section 4 of the complainant's written response. The claimed prior survey conflict does not appear in any record I am presented with today. Is there additional documentation your client can provide?" Harrington conferred in a low voice with Cade and then said carefully that there was not. "Then I am ruling in favor of the respondent," Webb said. "Mrs. Morgan's claim stands as filed. The eastern boundary as surveyed is confirmed. Mr. Cade's complaint is dismissed." He set his pen down with a precision that made it final. "I will also note for the record that filing a complaint of this nature without adequate supporting documentation represents a misuse of the county process, and any future complaints of a similar nature will be examined with that consideration in mind." Cade's face went through several expressions rapidly. Harrington gathered his papers. The room behind Grace erupted in a sound that was small but warm, not quite applause, because this was a courthouse, but the sound of restrained satisfaction, several people exhaling at once, Walt Gruber making a sound of approval low in his chest. Grace allowed herself one full breath. Then she turned to Freeman and shook his hand. She turned toward the room, and across the heads of the assembled people her eyes found Elijah in the back, and his face, which was generally so composed, was doing something entirely unguarded. He was not smiling exactly, but his eyes were, there was no better word for it, shining. She held that for just a moment. Then Clara, who had been sitting very properly next to Mrs. Aldridge through the whole proceeding and had maintained a 6-year-old's heroic composure, tugged Grace's sleeve. "Does this mean our house is still ours?" she asked. "Yes," Grace said, crouching to her daughter's level. "Our house is still ours." "Good," Clara said decisively. "I was going to be very annoyed if it was not." Grace laughed, a real, full laugh that surprised her, and scooped Clara up, and walked out of the courthouse into the cold November air with her daughter on her hip and her land secure, and her heart doing something that she was now ready to stop pretending she did not understand. Elijah was waiting outside. He was standing at the foot of the courthouse steps with his hat in his hands and the cold air turning his breath to vapor, and when she came out with Clara, he looked at her with the same unhidden thing in his face that she had seen across the room inside. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He shook his head slightly, the automatic deflection. She stopped it. "Elijah," she said, "I mean it, all of it, since April." He held her gaze. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about what you said in September." The people moving past them on the courthouse steps ceased to matter entirely. The November cold, the sound of the town, the lingering satisfaction of the legal victory, all of it went to the edges of her awareness. "I have been thinking," she continued, "that the answer I should have given you in September was not come back next Saturday." He was very still. "The answer," she said, "should have been yes. There is a place for you in what I am building." She paused and looked at him honestly. "I have not said it before now because I needed to be certain and because I needed some things to be mine first in a way that nothing would take." "And now," he said, "the land is mine," she said. "The claim stands. The walls are solid. I know who I am, and I know what I am doing, and I know that I want," she took a breath, "I want you to stop driving 12 miles in one direction on your Saturdays when you could be building something closer." Something happened in his face that she had not seen before, something that was openly, unmistakably joyful. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, "that is about the most practical declaration of feeling I have ever heard." "I am a practical woman," she said. "You are," he said, and the warmth in those two words was a whole conversation. "And yes, yes to all of it." Clara, from her position on Grace's hip, surveyed Elijah with the seriousness she brought to important matters. "You can bring copper more often," she said. "I fully intend to," Elijah said, and he looked at Grace, and they were, for the first time, both simply happy. The winter of 1873 into 1874 was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard. Not always violent, but relentless and cold. the wind coming off the plains with a patience that wore on a person over months. Grace's soddy held well, better than she had feared, the thick walls doing their insulating work and the stove eating through her fuel supply at a rate that kept her busy replenishing it. Elijah was not there every day, because they were both adults with their own claims to manage and their own work to do, and they both understood that their independence was not something to be sacrificed to proximity. But he was there often enough, and when the weather was very bad he stayed over in the small lean-to he had built against the back of the soddy for exactly that purpose, which was practical and proper, and which Mrs. Aldridge, when she heard of it, said was sensible frontier arrangements. What had settled between them by December was something Grace had no ready framework for, because it was not what her marriage to Thomas had been. That had been the love of two young people who grew up together and built together from the beginning, and she carried it still, as something complete in itself. What she had with Elijah was different. It was two people who had lived their separate lives fully, and who had then, in middle of a wide open landscape, chosen each other with the full weight of knowing what that meant. They talked in the evenings, long conversations that ranged through everything. His years in Texas, her years in Missouri, books they had both read, what they believed about God and the land and what people owed each other, Clara's remarkable observations about the world, the practical future of their claims, what spring planting would look like, whether one parcel or two was the long-term plan. This last conversation happened in late January when the cold had settled in for its deepest duration and the world outside the soddy window was gray and still and the stove made the interior close and warm. Clara was asleep. "The Prescott foreman offered me a full-time position," Elijah said. "He was mending a piece of harness by the lamp and he said it without looking up." Grace looked at him. "Doing what?" "Running the South Range. More pay, more responsibility." He paused. "Which would make building my own claim slower." She was quiet a moment, understanding the shape of what he was and was not saying. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what we are doing," he said, and looked up at her now. "You and I, because what I do with that offer depends on what the answer to that question is." The lamp between them made the small room feel contained and complete. "I think," Grace said slowly, "that two claims 8 miles apart is not a long-term arrangement that makes sense for two people who intend to build a life together." "No," he agreed. "It is not. My claim is further along," she said, thinking through it aloud. "The soddy is solid, I have the creek, the field is broken." "Your land is better," he said simply. "Honestly, the spring feeding your creek is worth more than anything I have on my parcel." "You have more cleared acreage," she said, "which could be sold or relinquished." They looked at each other across the table. "Elijah," Grace said, "are you suggesting that you move your proving up to my claim?" "I am suggesting," he said, "that if two people are going to prove up on land together, it makes more sense to prove up on the same 160 acres. That would require," she said carefully, "a legal arrangement." "Yes," he said, "it would." The lamp flickered once and settled. "I am not asking you to give up anything," he said, with a directness that was both characteristic and important. "I am not asking you to give up your name or your independence or your claim to what you have built. I am asking if you would be willing to build it with me, legally, properly." Grace set down the sock she had been darning and looked at her hands for a moment. She thought about Thomas and felt his absence as a gentle presence rather than a sharp loss, the way grief softens over time without disappearing. She thought about who she was now, after Missouri, after the wagon ride, after the soddy walls and the land office and the hearing, and every morning on her own land watching the sunrise come up over the Kansas grass. She thought about what she wanted the next 20 years to look like. She looked up at Elijah. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." The smile that moved across his face then was the fullest one she had ever seen from him, slow and certain and completely real. "Then I will turn down the Prescott offer," he said. "Do that," she agreed, "and I will speak to Reverend Holt." They were married in March of 1874, in the small white church on the eastern edge of Hays City, on a morning when the first real warmth of spring was in the air, and the mud in the streets smelled of thaw and renewal. The wedding was small Mrs. Aldridge, Walt Gruber, Anders Lindqvist and his son, Aldous Freeman and his wife, a handful of the neighboring homesteaders who had come to know Grace over the winter months. Clara wore her good dress with the white collar and stood next to her mother with the solemnity of a child who understood that something important was happening, and she held Elijah's hand as well as Grace's during the prayer, which no one had asked her to do, but which no one tried to stop. Reverend Holt, who was a young man with an earnest face who had only been in Hays City 8 months himself, read the ceremony with genuine feeling. When he asked Elijah if he took Grace, Elijah said, "I do," in the quiet, certain voice of a man who had said few things in his life more surely. When he asked Grace, she said, "I do," and looked directly at Elijah when she said it, and she did not look away. Walt Gruber cried, which surprised everyone including himself. He covered it by blowing his nose loudly into his handkerchief and pretending it was allergies, which no one was fooled by and everyone had the good grace to accept. After the ceremony, they all went to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house for a meal that Mrs. Aldridge had prepared with the serious application of a woman who considered good cooking a form of civic duty. There was bread and roasted beef and pie, 2 kinds, apple and rhubarb, and Walt Gruber made a brief toast that was genuinely moving despite being grammatically unusual. Mrs. Aldridge cried more openly than Walt had, and did not pretend it was allergies. They went home to the claim that afternoon, all 3 of them, Clara falling asleep in the wagon bed before they were 3 miles out of town, wrapped in a quilt, one hand loosely holding 2 of her best rocks. Elijah drove the wagon. Grace sat beside him on the bench with the spring air on her face and the land opening out around them, familiar and hers, familiar and theirs. He reached over after a mile and took her hand. She turned it over and held his, and they rode the rest of the way home like that. Spring came full into its power and they planted together. A real planting, not just the kitchen garden now but the field, 40 acres of winter wheat and a smaller section of corn, managed with the pair of mules that Elijah had brought from his property along with his tools, and a good trunk of books that had made Grace look at him with particular warmth when they unloaded it from the wagon. The work was enormous but shared, which made it different in nature. Grace had not realized, until she had help that was genuinely collaborative rather than hired, how much the sheer physical labor had been wearing on her in ways she had stopped noticing. It was not that she could not do it alone. She had been doing it alone, but doing it with someone who matched her pace and her commitment, and who did not need to be told what needed to happen next, who read the land with her and thought alongside her, was a different kind of experience entirely. Elijah built onto the soddy in June. He extended the back wall to create a second sleeping room. Clara had been deeply supportive of this project from the beginning, and had provided detailed architectural opinions that were only occasionally realistic. And he built a proper cooking area with a better stove that he had found second-hand in Hays City, and cleaned up, and installed with the care of a man who considered the stove the most important piece of furniture in the house. Clara, installed in her new room, arranged her good rocks along the windowsill with the careful deliberation of a curator. "They can see outside now," she explained to Elijah seriously. "Good thinking," he said, equally seriously. "She shows them the sunrise," Grace informed him from the doorway. Elijah looked at Clara's collection with what Grace had come to recognize as genuine warmth, the straightforward and patient affection he had for her daughter, which had never been performed or effortful but had simply been present from the beginning. "They are fine rocks," he said to Clara. "They deserve a good view." Clara looked at him with the earnest intensity she brought to important assessments. "You are a good man," she said. He went quiet for a moment. "I am trying to be," he said. "You are doing well," Clara told him, patted his arm, and went back to positioning a particularly fine piece of limestone. Grace met Elijah's eyes across the room, and what passed between them in that look was the kind of thing that would not fit inside words, and both of them knew it. Franklin Cade made one more attempt, in the summer of 1874, this time involving a boundary claim from an adjacent landowner who turned out to be a cousin of Cade's, which Judge Webb identified with approximately 30 seconds of examination, and dismissed with a pointed comment about frivolous claims that made it to the Hays City newspaper, and was, by all accounts, the effective end of Cade's local land speculation operation. Cade left the county by fall. Clement Briggs, the land agent, never became a pleasant man, but he became a noticeably more procedurally careful one. Grace finished proving up her claim in the spring of 1878, 5 years from the filing date, and received her final patent certificate from the land office. She had made it herself. The 5 years of residence, the improvements, the cultivation, all of it documented and witnessed. Elijah had been there for 4 of those 5 years, working the land alongside her with the same commitment she brought to it, and his name on the patent was beside hers, which was right. She stood on the porch of their house, a real house now, built from proper timber and plank siding, replacing the soddy that had served them through the proving-up years, and held the patent in both hands and let herself feel the full weight of it. Elijah came and stood beside her and read it over her shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Clara, who was now 11 and considerably taller, and who had recently announced her ambition to become a cartographer, came running from the barn where she had been helping with the horses and demanded to see the document, read it carefully, and then looked up with something in her eyes that Grace recognized. "It is really ours," Clara said. "It really is," Grace said. "It was always going to be," Elijah said. Clara nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had calculated long ago, and handed the document back to her mother and went back to the barn because there was still work to be done. That evening they sat on the porch in the June warmth, all 3 of them, watching the sun go down over the wheat field that was standing high and green in the long light. The farm had grown steadily over the 5 years, more acreage broken, a proper barn, a root cellar, a chicken house, 2 horses of their own, the mule team, a milk cow named Prudence who had opinions about everything. The kitchen garden was abundant, and Grace's preserves had become something of a local institution. They had neighbors now, 3 other homestead families within 5 miles, and the area had developed the loose community of mutual aid that frontier settlements built in the absence of formal infrastructure. People who helped each other with harvests, and who came to each other in sickness, and who shared knowledge of the land freely because everyone's survival was connected. Walt Gruber had died in the winter of 1876, which had saddened Grace more than she had expected, because he had been unexpectedly important to her story, standing up that day in the land office when she needed a second witness, and all the small kindnesses after. They had buried him in the town cemetery, and Grace had planted a prairie rose on his grave in spring, because she had learned that he liked them. Mrs. Aldrich had, in the fall of 1875, married a hardware merchant named Pemberton and was now Mrs. Pemberton, and was, by all accounts, considerably happier in this state than she let on. Anders Lindqvist and his son had proved up their own claim 2 years prior, and were now farming 70 acres successfully, and Anders had taken to stopping by the Haskins place every few weeks to exchange news and share the Swedish rye bread that his wife made, which Grace had strong opinions about, and those opinions were entirely positive. On the porch that evening, with the patent certificate safely inside the house, and the sun painting the wheat gold and the first fireflies beginning to appear along the creek bank, Grace leaned against Elijah's shoulder and he put his arm around her and they watched the light change. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was not when I walked into that land office in April. I was not brave," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I was desperate and practical and I had run out of other options. Brave is something you choose when you have a choice." He was quiet for a moment. "You had a choice," he said finally. You could have stayed at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house. You could have looked for work in town. You could have gone back to Missouri. You chose this. She thought about that. You told me it was the bravest thing you had ever seen, she said. It was, he said, and I stand by that. You had only seen 28 years of things at that point, she said, a small warmth in her voice. I have seen 33 years of things now, he said, and I still stand by it. She looked out at the land, her land, their land, the field they had planted together and the barn they had built and the creek running silver in the evening light. Thank you, she said, for standing up that day. Thank you for giving me a reason to, he said. She turned her head to look at him, this man she had chosen with her full self and her full knowledge, and he looked back at her in the evening light with the same open honesty he had carried since the first day, the thing that had never been performance. She kissed him, on the porch in the long June dusk, with the fireflies coming up from the creek grass and the wheat standing tall and true, and he held her with the certainty of a man who knew exactly where home was. Clara's voice came from inside the house. Are you two being sentimental on the porch again? Yes, Grace and Elijah said simultaneously. Fine, Clara called back, with the tolerant exasperation of an 11-year-old who has accepted that adults are occasionally impossible. Supper is in an hour. They heard her moving around in the kitchen, where she had apparently taken upon herself the project of learning to cook, with results that were unpredictable but never boring. Grace made a mental note to go check on whatever was happening with the stove before it became a full event. But she stayed on the porch another few minutes, inside the circle of Elijah's arm, watching the last of the light leave the Kansas sky, and she let herself be fully present in it, in the life she had built from nothing, in the love she had found in the middle of a wild and difficult landscape, in the particular beauty of a thing that was entirely her own. In the spring of 1879, their son was born. They named him Thomas, after Grace's first husband, which was a thing Elijah suggested himself one evening without Grace having raised it, and which told her something about him that she had not needed told but was moved by all the same. Thomas James Haskins arrived on a March morning when the last of the snow was melting off the wheat field, with Mrs. Aldridge, now Mrs. Pemberton, attending as midwife, and he came into the world loudly and with visible opinions about his situation, which Grace felt suggested a personality she was going to have strong feelings about. Elijah held him in the first hour with the careful attention of a man handling something infinitely precious, and he looked at Grace over the child's head with a look that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Clara, 12 years old, inspected her half-brother with the analytical rigor she brought to most things, declared him small but structurally adequate, and then went and picked out one of her best rocks, a smooth piece of pale quartz she had been particularly attached to, and placed it on the windowsill of the nursery. For him, she said, so he has a good view. Grace watched her daughter do this and felt something so wide and warm in her chest that it almost hurt. Thomas grew, as babies do, into a small and then a larger person, full of the perpetual motion that small boys on farms inhabit as their natural state, following Elijah around the property with the devotion of a duckling and demanding explanations for the operation of everything he encountered. Elijah gave these explanations with a patience that was inexhaustible and a seriousness that Thomas clearly found satisfying. Clara taught him his letters before he was 4 and told him sternly that cartography was an option available to him when he was older if he applied himself. The farm continued to grow. They added acreage in 1880, purchasing a neighboring parcel from a family that was moving north to Montana, which gave them enough land to carry a real cattle operation alongside the crops. They hired 2 hands that winter, young men fresh from the East with more enthusiasm than experience, and Grace found that she had an unexpected capacity for teaching, for conveying the specific intelligence of the land without condescension. She thought sometimes about the injustice of what had been required of her to get here, not just her own struggle but the larger picture, The way the frontier was supposedly open, but was in practice shaped by all the usual forces of power, who got help and who got doors shut in their faces, who got to file claims easily, and who had to fight for it through legal process and lawyers they could barely afford. She thought about the Cheyenne man, Running Fox, who had given her information about her land that she had relied on land that had been his people's land not long before, taken through treaties that were worth less than the paper they were written on, and she felt the weight of that complexity and did not try to simplify it away. The frontier was not only the story of people building something. It was also the story of what and who had been moved aside to make the building possible, and the honest telling of it had to carry both. These were the things she talked about with Elijah in the evenings, and he listened and engaged and had his own thoughts about it, and she was glad to be married to a man who did not need her to keep the uncomfortable parts of things quiet. By 1882, the farm was genuinely prosperous, not wealthy by any city standard, but solid and real and growing. The cattle operation was doing well. The wheat crops had been reliable for 3 years running, and they had managed to put away enough money to rebuild the farmhouse properly, with a second story and a proper parlor with a window that faced the creek, and let the afternoon light in gold and long across the floor. Grace stood in that parlor one afternoon in October of 1882, 9 years after she had walked into the Hayes City Land office with $14 and a folded deed and more nerve than she had known she possessed, and she looked out the window at the land. The wheat had been harvested, and the fields were the golden brown of late autumn. The barn stood solid against the sky. Copper, old now and retired from working life, moved slow and comfortable in the paddock. Clara, 15 and magnificent, was somewhere near the creek with her surveying notebooks and her particular mission. Thomas, 3 years old and a force of nature, was somewhere with Elijah, because he was always somewhere with Elijah. Grace heard them before she saw them, Thomas's high, carrying voice demanding to know why the water went that direction and Elijah's low, patient voice explaining it. And then the two of them came over the rise together, Thomas clinging to Elijah's hand and matching his stride with the concentrated effort of small legs. And the sight of it, the simple, daily sight of it, made Grace put her hand flat on the window glass. This was the thing she had built. Not the land, though the land was real and hard-won and hers. Not the house, though the house was solid and good. This. The life inside it, the people moving through it with her. The door opened and Thomas came running in loudly about the creek, and Elijah came in behind him and hung up his hat and found Grace in the parlor and looked at her with the question that had become a kind of language between them, "Are you all right?" And she nodded and smiled and meant it completely. "Come here," she said. He came and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out at the farm together in the October afternoon, and Thomas ran through the parlor and out the back door again with the boundless trajectory of 3-year-olds, and they heard Clara's voice from somewhere near the creek telling him to slow down near the bank, and then his answering shout of protest, and then the comfortable familiar sounds of their life. "I have been thinking," Grace said. "You are always thinking," he said warmly. "I have been thinking," she continued, "about writing down what happened, the filing, the hearing, all of it, not for vanity, but because I think someone should write it down." He turned to look at her. What brought this on? She thought about it. "Anders Lindqvist's daughter came to me last week," she said. "She is 20 years old and she has inherited her father's claim, and she wanted to know how to handle the land office. She was afraid they would not take her seriously." "What did you tell her?" "I told her exactly what to do," Grace said. "And then I thought how many women did not have someone to tell them, how many do not know they can. How many walked up to that counter and were turned away because no one stood up in the back of the room." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "Write it down," he said. "You write it clearly and I will help you get it to someone who can print it." She looked at him. "The editor at the Hayes City paper owes me a favor," he said. "And if not him, there is a newspaper in Topeka that has published pieces about homestead law before." She held his gaze. "You are a good man," she said. He shook his head. "You told me once that you needed some things to be yours first," he said. "This should be yours first too. Write it. I will help with whatever comes after." She thought about Clara saying you are a good man, standing on her tiptoes at age 11 to pat his arm with the gravity of a small judge delivering a verdict. She had always thought it was the most accurate assessment that had ever been rendered. She took his hand and held it, the way she had on the wagon bench coming home from their wedding, the way she had in 100 ordinary moments that added up to a life. "All right," she said. "I will write it." She did write it. Over the winter evenings of 1882, while the stove burned and Thomas slept and Clara worked on her maps with the focused intensity she had always brought to everything, Grace wrote it. She wrote it plainly and fully, the way she had spoken in front of Judge Webb, without embellishment but without omission either. She wrote about Thomas and Missouri and the newspaper column and the freight wagon. She wrote about the $14 and the land office and the men who would not witness and the one who did. She wrote about Cade and Freeman and Webb and the hearing. She wrote about proving up on the land through 5 years of hard work. She wrote about the Cheyenne man who had told her about her water source, and she wrote about what it meant that this land had been his people's before it was anyone she could file on, and she did not soften that. She wrote about what the Homestead Act actually said about women, and what that meant, and how to use it, and what to do when someone tried to stop you. Elijah read it when she was finished, sitting at the table by the lamp with the manuscript in both hands, reading it slowly and completely. When he was done, he set it down carefully. He looked at her. "It is very good," he said. "Is it honest?" "It is completely honest," he said. "It is also grace. People need to read this." She felt the truth of it and also the exposure of it. Writing something down was its own kind of filing a claim. "Send it," she said. He did. He rode into Hays City in February and gave it to the newspaper editor himself. And when that editor declined because he was worried about the parts that mentioned the land speculator by name, Elijah rode to Topeka and gave it to the editor there himself, which was a 2-day ride each way, which he made without being asked, and without mentioning the specifics of the difficulty. The Topeka Commonwealth published it in March of 1883, in full, under Grace's name. The response surprised her. Letters came, not many but some, from women across Kansas, and from as far as Nebraska and Colorado, women who had filed or were planning to file or had been turned away, asking questions, sharing their own stories, thanking her for writing it clearly and without condescension. One letter came from a woman in Wichita who had used the piece to convince a reluctant land office clerk to process her filing. One came from a homesteading widow in Nebraska who wrote simply that she had not known women could file until she read Grace's piece, and now she had, and the land was hers. That last letter Grace read 3 times and then set down on the table and sat with it for a quiet moment. Elijah was outside with Thomas, teaching the boy how to properly oil a harness, and Clara was inside working on her maps, and the kitchen smelled of the morning's bread, and Grace sat with that letter and thought about the April morning in 1873 when she had walked into a room full of doubtful men with $14, and a resolve she had not fully known she possessed. She thought about Elijah standing up in the back of that room, the quiet certainty of it, the way it had changed everything without changing the core of what she was doing, which was always hers to do. Clara looked up from her maps. "Good news." "Yes," Grace said. "From who?" "A woman in Nebraska," Grace said. "She filed a homestead claim." Clara considered this with the seriousness she brought to important information. "Good," she said, and went back to her maps. Grace folded the letter and put it with the others, in the drawer of the writing desk that Elijah had built her the previous Christmas, solid walnut, with small, precise drawers, built with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered. She looked out the window at the farm, 10 years from the filing date, almost exactly. The land was as she had imagined it, standing at this window in October, full and working and alive with the particular life of people who had put their hands and their years into a piece of earth and made it answer. Thomas came running in from outside at that moment, trailing mud and purpose, demanding to know if there was bread and whether he could have some and whether Copper could have some too. Yes, no, and absolutely not, Grace said, catching him by the collar as he passed and turning him back toward the door. Boots off first. He protested this vigorously but complied, and then accepted his bread with the focused satisfaction of a 4-year-old and took it back outside, where she could hear Elijah say something low and amused and Thomas's high voice answering. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them in the winter yard, her son and the man who was his father in the fullest sense. And she thought that the thing about building a life on your own terms was not that it was easier or lighter or free of grief and difficulty. It was that it was yours. The weight of it was your weight to carry, and the good of it was your good to keep, and the people inside it were there because you had chosen them and they had chosen you in full knowledge on an open plain with everything visible. She had chosen this. She had fought for this. She had proved it up herself with her own hands, and then she had shared it freely with the people she loved. That, she thought, was the whole of it. She went back inside and put more wood in the stove, because the January cold was coming hard off the plains, and there was supper to make and a family to feed, and the evening was beginning, and it was going to be a good one. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, not without sorrow, because the frontier was still the frontier, and the plains were still demanding, and the world was still imperfect in all its familiar ways, but full of the real texture of living. Clara did become a cartographer, or the nearest thing available to one in late 19th century Kansas. She worked with the State Land Survey Office from the time she was 20, making maps with the precision and dedication she had brought to her childhood rock collection, and she was regarded by her colleagues as formidably competent, which was the assessment she preferred over any other. She married at 24, a geologist named Samuel Hurst, who had the good sense to recognize in her something exceptional, and who Grace and Elijah both approved of after the appropriate period of evaluation. Thomas grew up on the farm and grew up interested in it, the wheat and the cattle and the water management, and the mechanics of keeping a working operation running, and he had his mother's practical intelligence, and his father's patience, and a laugh that Elijah said came from somewhere else entirely, and that Clara said was absolutely recognizable to anyone who had ever seen Grace genuinely amused by something. They had a daughter in 1884, whom they named Eliza, and she arrived with the same opinions about the world that Thomas had announced on his own arrival, and grew up to share her brother's love of the land and her sister's love of books and her parents' combined stubbornness about getting things right. Elijah bought out the additional parcel to the north in 1886, which brought their total land to nearly 400 acres, and the farm had grown into a genuine operation by then, something they had built from 160 raw acres and $14, and a courage that looked like stubbornness and a man in the back of a room who had the goodness to stand up. In 1892, almost 20 years after Grace had walked into that land office, the County Historical Society asked her to speak at their annual gathering about the early homesteading years. She accepted, and she stood up in front of a room of Hays City residents with the same clear, steady voice she had used at the counter in 1873 and at Judge Webb's hearing in 1874, and she told them the real story of what homesteading had been, the work and the fear, and the legal battles and the community and the injustices she had witnessed, and the good people she had known and lost. Elijah sat in the back of the room. She saw him when she looked up from her notes, and she smiled the full, private smile that she kept for him, the one that said everything a decade and a half of life together had accumulated between them, all of it present in a single look. He held her gaze from across the room with those dark, patient eyes, and he smiled back. And she thought about April of 1873, and a man unfolding himself from a chair in a land office to say a simple and certain word, and all the years that had grown from that single moment of goodness, the land and the house and the children, and the life that was theirs and was real and was built from the ground up with their own hands together. She thought, this is what a life looks like when you refuse to let anyone take it from you. She looked down at her notes and then put them down entirely, because she knew what she needed to say and she was going to say it plainly, the way she had always said everything that mattered. The land is still ours, she said to the room. And outside the window, the Kansas plains stretched wide and golden and endless, as they had always done and always would, belonging to everyone and to no one, waiting to be claimed by whoever had the courage to file.